Welcome back to the Money Medicine Podcast, where today we're going to be discussing strategies to grow your business, tools to accelerate that growth, and how top practices and pharmacies are executing and winning. All right, it's been a little bit since we launched or put out a new podcast, but we're excited about the kind of new direction and retooling of what we wanted this podcast to be. And we're getting off to a hot start today, talking about programs, talking about services, talking about consultations, and being thoughtful about going into Q1 of 2024, especially on the pharmacy side, thinking about some margin compression, some cash flow issues that may or may not be popping up with the DIR fees and those changes going into the new year. So for a lot of pharmacies, for a lot of businesses, whether you're a pharmacy, a clinic, a practice, what have you, you're taking a look at services, you're taking a look at cash-based services that you can implement. Logan and I know a thing or two about that, have been working together on that for the past couple of years. Logan and his pharmacy have been thoughtful about that, and he's had some recent success in that department. And so today we kind of wanted to unpack some things to avoid, because if you jump right into it, there's a lot of mistakes that you can make. And so Logan and I wanted to put together a podcast to make sure we unpacked and uncovered some of those things, so that if you start to roll out some of these things, you do not have to learn the hard way. You do not have to pay the dumb tax. You can just listen to us and maybe get some insightful things to consider.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a topic that hurts a lot of businesses, especially as businesses start to move away from utilizing insurance companies for reimbursement. We're seeing a lot of companies definitely decreasing, not only in the pharmacy space, but in the functional medicine and provider space. The PBMs are really crushing us. And so knowing how to price your services is going to be really important.
Yeah. So before we get into all the different maybe things to avoid, let's talk a little bit about real quick your journey in kind of consultation services, etc. Because plenty of people are going to be starting out from square one. It's their first consultation. It's their first appointment. Largely in a cash-based scenario where they're trying to sell maybe a higher ticket service. We'll talk about that in a second. But talk to me a little bit about maybe 2020 when you first started doing your initial consultations, maybe some beliefs that you had. And then we can kind of talk about some lessons learned and maybe what the beliefs are kind of now.
Absolutely. So 2020, we started doing like 6-week programs where it was like, overviewing how to improve someone's health. And so what we did is we set it up. I want to say that the appointment was free. And then, you were responsible for selling that service beyond that for what you were doing. And I want to say that the services for 6 weeks of time was right around like $300, which in hindsight I will cover later. But when you're looking at it and you're doing that, you have to make sure that the costs that you're using and the time frame for that makes sense. So that's definitely one thing to kind of look at, because now, flash forward from 2020 to 2023, just recently we had a $2,600 service for a year, right? And so making sure that you're going through that, and the hindsights in between where we were at and where we're at now is completely different.
Yeah. So would it be fair to say 2020 $300 sounded like a lot? You thought you were probably charging a lot for a service, and now $2,600. You just kind of got done telling me before the podcast launched, like you kind of felt like the customer was getting a pretty good deal.
Yeah, definitely. For the service that somebody was getting, $300 was really nothing. But at the time, I thought I was asking like them to give me their like firstborn child, and it didn't. I didn't feel comfortable asking for that amount. And then,
but now it rolls off the tongue a little bit easier.
Oh, yeah. Now I know it's like, if you really value my time, this is what my time costs, because it's pulling me away from other things that I could be using that time for. And so it doesn't hurt as much to ask, for reasonable compensation.
For sure. for those of you that don't know, that haven't listened to other podcasts, maybe we haven't discussed it in future or in previous podcasts as in depth, but this was one of the first things that Logan and I met and kind of started working on, was this kind of program, this kind of structure. Again, we're going to use some prices. We might say some things that will shock you, I guess, in maybe a pricing perspective of maybe what you thought you could charge. But I would definitely encourage you, just as a side note, to take a look at, industries like, fitness or what have you, where I promise there are, 18, 20, 22, 24-year-old kids, largely, charging hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, depending on the duration of the, relationship, for far less comprehensive kind of services that you can offer your patients. So again, it's a big belief to break. Can totally understand maybe hearing the numbers that Logan's kind of articulating here and being shell-shocked. But I promise you can charge a lot more than you can. And that's what we're going to kind of talking about here in some of the mistakes to avoid. And that brings us right into the first one, which is underestimating costs.
Right. And so it's really difficult not to underestimate your costs, because a lot of times you're like, oh, well, I have to cover my hourly rate, right? So, average pharmacist is probably making anywhere from $50 to $70. And they might be like, oh, I could just charge $70 an hour. But you're not accurately figuring out your expenses, because you're not figuring out what else does that time really cover. And it can lead you down into some other, financial troubles in the future. So that's definitely one thing to avoid. For instance, let's say I sit down with a patient and I tell them, hey, it's going to be $300 for 6 weeks. In that same 6-week time period, if I could have done 50 or 100 COVID vaccines, I would make far more money on doing that. And it'd probably take me a lot less time and thought to do that than to follow through with a program. So that's definitely one thing that you have to make sure that's worth your time as well.
And kind of the opportunity cost. If we're going to do this program, if I'm going to spend this time, is it the highest use of my time? For sure, which is something that needs to be weighed in on, for sure. And in that underestimating cost thing, I mean, there's so much to unpack here. We can make this a really long episode. We're going to try not to. But maybe it'll lead to some smaller micro podcasts that we could do on this. But the other thing about like underestimating costs, and Logan, I know you know this, but if you charge too little, you will attract the type of patient you don't want to work with. And right. I think that's the most common, probably mental frame to break, especially for pharmacies, is you're so used to accommodating everyone, especially if you're just a retail pharmacy, maybe with compounding that's phased out a little bit because some people can or can't afford maybe some of the stuff that you're doing. But by and large, you're never looking to say no to a patient. It's always like, well, how do I make it work? Do I need to cut costs, or can I give you a discount and then try to make it up later? And there's just this natural mindset to just accommodate everyone. But the downside of that is the type of people, that are, typically the ones that might fight you on price and want it to be very, very cheap. And you might want it to be cheap to accommodate more volume. But one of the things you'll run into is that those people will not be committed. And if the price point doesn't matter to them, and it's throwaway money largely that they're okay with losing, you will attract people that aren't serious, which are draining to you. And then that makes you less fulfilled, less energized to support the people that are serious. And it takes away from maybe the fulfillment that the program or the services could have, because half your people ghost you and half your people, or 25%, get decent results, and then another 25% get great results, right? Versus getting very, very committed people because they're paying a premium, or even paying a decent number. It doesn't even have to be a premium, right? And those are the type of patients, correct me if I'm wrong, Logan, and you can probably speak to examples that you want to work with.
Absolutely. You don't want, if you throw out your number for your consulting or your service, whatever it happens to be, and somebody doesn't kind of take like oh wow, like, you're probably going to get somebody who's either not going to follow through on your program or your service, and then they're going to get kind of hogwashed results, and then they're not going to be happy with the service. They'll leave you a bad review. Those aren't the people that you want to work with. So that's definitely something to to really take key of, because I've ran into that multiple times where I've discounted pricing and
Your heart was in the right place.
Yeah, because I wanted the person to feel better and get better, but then they didn't
Can't
have
want it
enough,
more than them.
right? And they didn't have enough skin in the game at that point, because they're like, well, $300, whatever. Whereas if you say, hey, I just paid $2,000, I better do this, like, you're going to have a much more incentive to actually follow through. And patients who are tied down to this belief that, hey, everything should either be free or as cheap as possible, they're just not going to work as hard for it. And so that's going to lead you down a lot of bad rabbit holes.
For sure. Now, I know the other one that we've worked with so many times, we've got a bunch of different variations of kind of specifically what it looked like. But I know largely now you create programs, you don't say anything to me because you don't need to, because you understand the concept of it, is tiered pricing and incorporating distracted pricing. And if you don't know what distracted pricing is, we'll try to consolidate it, make it easy. But it's basically the determination of where you put your middle priced program will impact the perception or impact the kind of selection of your different packages. So for example, if you go to McDonald's, you go to a movie theater, etc., you will notice that the small is typically, let's just say, I'm going to use easy numbers here, so don't quote me on this inflation metric, but let's just say it's $2 for a small drink, a small fountain drink. But the medium is $4 and the large is $4.50. Because you move the medium option closer to the large, people are more willing to just take that incremental increase because it's like, oh, it's only 50 cents more and I get the large. Versus if your small was $2, your medium was $3, and then your large was $4.50, people would by and large choose that medium option because it's slightly better than the small. They see the value in just that dollar difference, but instead of spending $4.50 with you, they spend $3. And so that's the concept of distracted pricing. And whether you use distracted pricing or you use tiered pricing, I guess, Logan, over to you in regards to packages. How do you think about, or what did it look like for the person, for example, that could work with you between how you use some distracted pricing and or tiered pricing to get them to want to work with you for a longer period, for a higher dollar amount, etc.?
Yeah, so I recently adjusted my process for that. And so I always give them an hourly rate. So it's a typically, much smaller amount. But I always let them know, like, hey, obviously there's going to be some changes in variables in doing that, and we're not going to probably see the end benefit. And then I typically will say, well, based on, this is kind of where I divert and I kind of create that tiered system. I think at a minimum you're going to need generally 6 months, but ideally, a year is what I'd like to work with you, because I know that we can achieve your goals. And when I start to break that up, I give them that small, right, hourly, that small amount, right. The medium, that 6 months, is typically, this last one, it was $1,800, and I said, then for your 12 months would be $2,600. And so once again, it's that same strategy in a way, except that first piece was an hourly versus a package kind of rate, if that makes sense.
For sure. So in that example, your medium option, your 6 months, if you took the $2,600, which is your highest option, and you find that middle point, that median, which is $1,300, is halfway between the $2,600, you priced your medium option closer to your large, and so people were more willing to say, okay, well, I get an extra 6 months at only an extra $800, so those last 6 months are actually really cheap relative to the first 6 months, so I might as well take them up on it, and I probably do need the full year, right? And so again, they went from that medium option for you to the large option,
right,
if you will, using the drink example. So I think that's another super critical point, is using tiered pricing, because they won't really be interested in your bottom two options if they're like logically thinking and seriously interested. And that's kind of what you want, right? Because you want sufficient time with them. You want to be able to put in like practical, solutions that, get the patient the result that they want while also not, destroying them in the process, right? Because you're able to have a little bit more room to work with. And so I think, what's important to remember is like you want them to choose that top option. That is the best scenario for both you, for the patient. They're most committed. You're most committed. The best margin for you as a business, which is important to remember, and it's going to yield the best results, right? And I think we can all think of examples where we spent more than probably we wanted on a service or a product. In some cases, for sure, you regret it. But by and large, some of my favorite things, like I paid a premium for them, and I was really glad that I did.
Right.
And this, program or looking at programs like this would be no different.
Well, it kind of brings me to the next point is when you have them for a longer period of time, and you kind of mentioned this as well, right? You're going to have more profitability and growth, but the other thing is all the back end sales. So when we do a program, we're not including things like supplements or other testing and other services like that within the program. That program is specifically just for time. And so you need to make sure that that time is also being supported in other means. So specifically for us, we do testing, we do supplements, we might get prescriptions on the backside. And that's can be done for a lot of different business owners, right? If you are running a clinic, you could be doing, supplements as well, but your other testing, you could have them go through and, through that testing, be like, hey, well, we also found XYZ, so now you're going to have to work for us, to get that taken care of. It's another 6 months. A lot of different things that you can do, so that way you're not sacrificing any profitability. And so that's another key thing to make sure that you're not just giving them the world to begin with. Otherwise, they're going to expect the world the whole time.
Yeah, I think a lot of pharmacies, businesses, practices, etc., run into the fallacy maybe that when they come up with a program, especially early on, it's the first time, not a lot of context, maybe you're not following something that's been done by other people, you're just kind of coming up with it, is you assume that it takes less time than it actually ends up taking, right? So like your consultation might be an hour, but how many times do you end up like having to do additional research or look into things? And so if you price based on like, oh, it's only going to take me 2 hours, it's similar to chores you do around your house where you're like, oh, it's only going to take me 30 minutes to cut the lawn. And then all of a sudden you run out of gas, and then you got to run to the gas station to get gas for your lawnmower to cut the grass. And then instead of a 30-minute project, it's 2 hours. That happens all the time inside of these programs. And if you don't price to protect yourself from that, you are going to lose money on these programs and work a ton or do more and see no benefit at the bottom line.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was something that I made the mistake of the first time through is they would come to me and they'd have some odd diagnosis, something you see in less than 5% of patients. You're like, I don't know anything about that. Then you're doing looking into all these studies, reading all these studies, and then you've spent 4 or 5 hours now reading studies and saying, okay, here's what we can do, just to then bring that back to the patient. Patient says, no, I'm not going to do that. And then you're just like, I wasted all that time for nothing.
Yeah, completely.
So that can definitely be a frustrating piece.
For sure. We'll try to wrap this up so that we don't make this too long of an episode. I think it's one that we could spend a lot of time talking about, and we probably should. But I'll maybe leave you with one thing to consider when you're coming up with your price and coming up with your program that I think is a thoughtful question to ask both in this scenario and others. Comes from Keith Cunningham, which is, if you could only grow your business through the word of mouth or through the referrals of the current patients that you have, how would you treat those patients? What would you do for those patients? And so similarly, if you are creating a program and the only way you can get new patients inside of this program is through the word of mouth of the people that complete the program, what would you include, right? How you probably wouldn't do a skimpy, cheap, low ticket program because no one's going to tell anybody about it. You'd probably be really thoughtful about resources, assets, accountability, how you'd structure and what you talk about during your consultations. You'd put out a much better product. And so I think if you go into the mindset of how do I make this amazing, you'll also end up with a program that is far better than maybe other people that are charging for just flat services. And so you will make yourself less of a commodity, more rare, more unique in your local marketplace relative to your competitors. So thoughtful question to leave yourself with. But I guess we'll kind of wrap up with that. What do you think, Logan?
I think we're good.
Cool. All right. Well, appreciate you guys listening. Sorry for the hiatus. We're going to start cranking these out a little bit more frequently. We got a kind of a structure in place and hopefully bringing you guys a ton of value to help you not just today, but help you in your years to come. So again, thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, give us feedback. Let us know what you want to talk about. And if you want us to go more deep on this subject, we are happy to do so. Peace.